Most people, when reading the Arabic of the Quran, are confused regarding Muhammad's alleged first encounter with the angel Gabriel. Did Gabriel instruct Muhammad to read or to recite, and what are the differences, if any, between the two words?
The Oxford Dictionary makes a very important distinction between reading and reciting. Read is to look at and comprehend the meaning of written or printed matter by mentally interpreting the characters or symbols of which it is composed. Recite, on the other hand, is to repeat aloud or declaim a poem or a passage from memory before an audience. In the Arabic language also there are two distinct words describing the two actions of reading and reciting. Iqra means to read, that is to read from a document or from writings. Yatlu, on the other hand, means to recite, that is to declaim words from memory. Iqra is actually the first word of the first verse ayah of the first chapter surah of the Quran, but for ungodly reasons, during the compilation of the Quran, it was relegated to the 96th surah instead. Surah Al-Alaq 96.1. Read in the name of thy Lord and Cherisher, who created man out of a mere clot of blood. In Arabic, اقرأ باسم ربك الذي خلق الإنسان من علق. Bukhari Hadith 1.3. Suddenly the truth descended upon him, Muhammad, when he was in the cave of Hira. The angel came to him and asked him to read, Iqra. The Prophet replied, I do not know how to read. The Prophet added, the angel caught me forcefully and pressed me so hard that I could not bear it any more. He then released me and again asked me to read, and I replied, I do not know how to read. Thereupon he caught me again and pressed me a second time, till I could not bear it any more. He then released me and again asked me to read, but I replied, I do not know how to read. Thereupon he caught me for the third time and pressed me, and then released me and said, read, Iqra in the name of your Lord who has created man from a clot. This version of the alleged story of revelation produces two extremely contentious and important question marks that have to be pointed out that require some logical answers. A. It is inconceivable to accept, based on theological grounds alone, that the angel Gabriel, the supreme messenger of Allah, did not already know that Muhammad could not read. B. It goes even beyond credibility or logic that the angel Gabriel could have revealed to Muhammad a completely different version of the creation of man to that found in its original in the Bible. It is a measure of the complete lack of veracity and accuracy of the Quran that its first verse ever displays a remarkable ignorance of the biblical story of the creation of mankind. After all, he was created from dust and not a clot. The same Torah that the Quran itself repeatedly asserts to have been the word of Allah is perverted and given a completely different version. Why would Allah give two completely and utterly incompatible versions of His own creation story to two different messengers of His, Moses and presumably Muhammad? It is utter blasphemy to imply that Allah, if Allah is the same as the God of Israel and Jesus, could be so inconsistent about the method of His own creation. According to the Ahadith, stories about the sayings and way of life of Muhammad, he was unable to read and write. This is totally contradicted by the report mentioned in Ibn Ishaq's Surat Rasulullah, the first biographer of his life, about 120 years after his death. In this very first and original version of the alleged encounter between Muhammad and the angel Gabriel, the angel actually produced a coverlet of brocade whereupon was some writing. Hence, verse 96.1 can only make sense if Muhammad could read what was written on the coverlet. This would obviously change the whole state of affairs, as deliberately altered and falsified by the later Muhammadans dramatically and fundamentally. Our listeners should be aware that since Ibn Ishaq was both an Arab and a Muhammadan Muslim and was historically the nearest to the sources of information, his report should have obviously greater reliability than the ones that were mass-produced much later. He cannot be accused of fabrication as a foreigner or as an enemy of Muhammadan Islam. When Gabriel ordered him to read, Muhammad asked him correctly and sensibly, what shall I read? Since the coverlet had writings on it, as Muhammad himself asserts, then it is obvious and totally rational to assume that Gabriel wanted him to read the writing on the coverlet. Why else would Muhammad on 3 consecutive occasions reply by asking Gabriel, what shall I read? The astoundingly simple conclusion based upon Muhammad's answer alone by asking Gabriel, with what shall I read, instead of the altered version of I cannot read, asserts the fact that he could read. In the altered version of the story, the answer I cannot read is totally meaningless, implying the utter stupidity and ignorance of Gabriel regarding Muhammad's ability to read or not. Our listeners should be aware that for doctrinal and theological reasons, the later followers of Muhammad had done their best to obfuscate and confuse their followers and others as to the real meaning of the words depicting to read and to recite. This is confirmed in the altered and corrupted text of Bukhari Hadith 1.3 and 9.111. Hence, in our analysis and investigation to discover the facts, we must address the meanings of both words individually and thoroughly, even if we have to repeat certain ideas more than once. Version A1. Let us assume to start with that Bukhari's version of events is the factual one, and that Iqra does mean read. That is, to read from the words from a document or writings. Hence the logical question to be asked yet again is, how is it possible or logical that the angel of Allah did not know that Muhammad was unable to read, that he was illiterate? Moreover, according to the above version of the event, the hadith does not mention any item or document that was displayed by Gabriel for Muhammad to read from. Version A2. Now we take Bukhari's version and assume that Iqra means recite, that is, to repeat from memory. In this manner also, Muhammad's answer, I cannot read, or in this instance, I cannot recite, makes absolutely no sense, since Gabriel had not yet informed Muhammad of the Quranic verses to recite, and Muhammad was obviously at a loss as to what he was supposed to recite, and hence Muhammad should have replied, what should I recite? Once more, we have to come to the unavoidable conclusion that Gabriel, Allah's messenger, was yet again being depicted as ignorant and clueless. Version B1. Now let us investigate in the same manner Ibn Ishaq's original version of the events, and that Iqra means to read to start with. When Gabriel ordered him to read Iqra, implying the writing on the coverlet, Muhammad asked him correctly and sensibly, what shall I read? Because maybe he was not so sure. In this case, Gabriel obviously and correctly knew that Muhammad could read. Version B2. But if Iqra in this instance meant recite, Gabriel's command and Muhammad's answer, what shall I recite, become once again meaningless and irreconcilable, since Gabriel had, we reiterate again, not told Muhammad the Quranic verses that he wanted him to recite, rendering Gabriel once again as ignorant and clueless. We have now covered all the possible versions of the event, resulting in only one version that can possibly make any sense whatsoever, which is version B1, Ibn Ishaq's original, wherein Iqra means to read the writings from the coverlet. What is most important in all of the above analysis and investigation is the fact that the original story was given by Ibn Ishaq, who was after all the first and nearest writer to the events that transpired during the life of Muhammad, had been materially, linguistically and grammatically deliberately altered and tampered with to suit the subsequent theological arguments to fit the dogma of the divine source of the Quran. Hence Gabriel's request was correct, since actually Muhammad was able to read.